I think one of the biggest differences between when I first started practicing law in the 60s and practicing law now is that back then, lawyers, judges, and prosecutors all were trying to serve and search for or seek justice rather than law and order. And I'd like to cite a current example. The big political campaign issue is police reform. And there's a call to defund the police, etc. It's interesting, all the rhetoric goes around and nobody knows exactly what the hell it means. And, one group is saying it means we ought to abolish cops. Another one says it means something else, we should reform. But there's nothing really concrete that you can measure except for the fact there's a lot of dissatisfaction out there. Which brings to mind an occurrence that happened in the late 60s. One of my friends was a prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office. Probably one of the best opponents I'd ever faced. He and I were friends. He was in charge of the criminal defense question on the bar, and I was one of his graders. We had different backgrounds. I was from rural Colorado, and he was from the black area of Denver. He was a black man, played high school football, college football, very bright, and a rising star in the black community, or in the legal community, and as far as that goes. He later on ended up being the governor of a territory of the United States. But for this story, he was with the Attorney General's or the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver, but he got appointed to run a special investigation. And the investigation was to look into the death of a guy named Fred Hampton, who was a Black Panther leader in Chicago. Now, the case was really interesting. At that time, there had been the convention in Chicago where it ended up many protesters were prosecuted under various statutes, federal laws. A famous trial involving defense attorneys William Kunstler and Leonard Weinglass made national news and was followed with a lot of interest. And a group called the Black Panthers was getting a lot of publicity, and their leader, Fred Hampton, was in Chicago in his apartment when the apartment was raided. Now, several members of various strike forces, led by the state's attorney's office in Chicago, raided the building, raided the apartment, entered the apartment, and essentially, as Milton Branch described it, had a search and destroy mission for the Panthers inside. Now, it was real questionable what happened. According to the state's attorney, Hanrahan, somebody shot from the apartment, from inside the apartment, out. And they responded by shooting in through the door, shooting holes in the door, and actually killing the people inside the apartment. Or at least that was their official version. some thought when the door came open they finished people off, but it didn't matter. Everybody was dead. So this caused a lot of furor, a lot of activity among the black community, a lot of rationalization among the white community. The cops there were very, very defensive, and the investigation, I think, was what you'd call rather slipshod. Well, when Branch got appointed as special prosecutor, he asked me, we had lunch one day, and he asked me, he said, look, can you use your connections to get Gary, Mr. Gary, who was Black Panther attorney at that time, to let people testify in front of my grand jury. Right now, he's taking the position that the grand jury is corrupt, the government is corrupt, and it's not going to do any good, and will just increase the harassment against the Panthers if he allowed them to testify. In our conversation, he described the raid on Hampton's place as a search and destroy mission by the Chicago state's attorney and the U.S. Attorney's office, which was real curious. Here you got a federal official talking about law enforcement going on search and destroy missions against an opponent because it was racially motivated. Now that was the position of the Chicago Police Department, or the opinion of the Chicago Police Department by Justice Department officials in 1968, I think it was. Think how many years ago that was. And then ask yourself what's changed since then. Now, during the interim, much has been written about the FBI. One book in particular is called the Glass House Tapes. There's been a lot of talk about how they infiltrated the Panthers, how they tried to get Martin Luther King and his group, mainly Martin Luther King leadership, to embarrass himself. They wiretapped him and sent copies of wiretaps to his wife. Various bad conduct stuff of King they sent to the wife in order to cause a ruckus. None of it seemed to work. It would seem to me that when Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about black and white and civil rights, he posed no threat to the power structure, to the power elite. But after his big rally in Washington, D.C., the big march, and his I Had a Dream speech, he started talking about black and white together. And the problem started to become defined as an economic problem or a class struggle problem rather than a racial problem. Now, the power elite would prefer it to be defined, any problems to be defined as racial and not economics. And I think the crowning straw was when King started talking about international labor movements, international labor, and labor in general. And it occurred to me that he was allowed to exist and raise hell and do whatever he needed to do as long as it became a racial issue. But when he went to Memphis and got assassinated, he wasn't there it wasn't a racial issue, it was an economic issue. He was there supporting garbage collectors union and union activities and workers' rights and things such as this. Well, the power elite still likes to pit one race against another, and I think that was valid then and it's valid now. So I look at the Hampton matter as not a matter of race, but a matter of redistribution of economic and political power. And this is where a lot of the black radicals back then, particularly after the Chicago Convention, started looking at things. They looked at it more as a economic class, social class function, rather than a black and white thing, which I think scared the hell out of the leadership of the manufacturers and bankers and people like that. In any event, Milt Branch tried very hard to get me to talk to some of the Panther lawyers whom I knew and whom I tried cases with. And it was very curious because they viewed their roles as political advisors to look at the movement in general and the overall effect of various activities, and really determined that cooperating with the government, even in a murder investigation, would be detrimental to their movement as a whole. Now, I don't think, I never agreed with that position, by the way, but it was a valid position politically, and that's what happened. And it's unfortunate because nobody then really, well, I wouldn't say nobody, but people then lost interest in the Hampton thing. They did investigate, and they wanted to count the bullet holes, for instance, in the door. The door mysteriously disappeared from the Chicago evidence locker. And it wasn't until several years later that it did appear, and people got to examine the bullet holes. And there were 50 bullet holes going in and not a single bullet hole coming out. But the statute of limitations had run, and that didn't bring Hampton and his people back to life. But it did indicate the conduct of the state's police and also the strike force involving the state's attorney, the attorney general, and Justice Department through the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So why now, when we have police reform as a big agenda, does the FBI want to form these various strike forces? One locally is the new counterterrorism strike force. And the FBI now is now interested in terrorism and counterterrorism. They classified Martin Luther King as a terrorist, and they have a whole history of classifying political dissidents as terrorists. For instance, they went after the Communist Party in the 50s, and in most areas of the country, they went after SDS. Any group that was somewhat left in their proclivities ended up on the FBI watch list. And I really am curious to why the administration in Boulder, Colorado is interested in joining a task force led by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who are supposed to be a progressive community here. In any event, I hope the people and the people's representatives look into this matter and really educate themselves on the FBI and the conduct of the FBI. There's a lot written about it. My favorite was the Senate Select Committee and their findings, such as the COINTEL program and things like this. So it seems like the wheel is getting reinvented. Nobody's learning from history, with everybody concerned about various things. And idea of terrorism, we now are heading more and more into the police state and embedding the police state more and more into our lives and forms of government. And nobody's really talking about whether or not this is healthy for the people. It might be healthy for efficient government if that's the goal, but I don't think having the highest incarceration rate in the world is something that we should brag about. And I do think it's antithesis to the concept of justice. Please comment. Please give me some feedback. Um, that's all for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the Super Bowl as much as I plan to do. Talk to you all later. Bye for now.